You know the story, the garden, the serpent, the fall of humanity. It's one of the most foundational, and let's be honest, debated stories in all of Western literature. But what kind of story is it really? Are we reading a historical account of the world's very first moments? Or is it more of a timeless parable about what it means to be human? Okay, let's dive in and see what the text itself has to say.
We all think we know this story, right? It's the one we probably heard as kids. It's simple, it's incredibly dramatic, and it seems to explain so much about the world.
You've got all the elements, this perfect garden, a serpent that can talk, and of course, a single forbidden fruit. Adam and Eve make a choice, and that choice changes everything. Not just for them, but for, well, everyone who comes after. It's the ultimate story of innocence lost. But how we're actually supposed to read that story, that's where the real mystery begins.
For centuries, the debate over how to interpret these early chapters of Genesis has been really intense, and it's a conflict that goes right to the very heart of what this text is trying to tell us.
So you basically have two main camps, two big ways of looking at this. On one side, you have the view that this is literal history, a factual, eyewitness-style record of Adam, Eve, and the fall. But on the other side, there's this growing perspective that sees it as a symbolic parable, a story that isn't really about a specific event way back in the past, but about the timeless problems and the nature of humanity, about you and about me.
And this quote just perfectly captures that symbolic view. The idea here is that the real power of Genesis isn't about whether it's historically accurate, but in how it makes you feel this intense personal response. The story becomes a mirror, right? It reflects our own struggles, our own choices, our own relationship with the divine. So, with these two views on the table, let's do a little investigation. Let's look for clues inside the text itself.
Okay, our first clue isn't actually in the details of the story itself, but in the architecture of the entire book of Genesis. Like, how is this thing built? What's its blueprint?
So, the key to cracking the structure of Genesis is this one Hebrew word, toladoth. You can think of it like a chapter heading or a title that signals to the reader, hey, what you're about to read is the history of what came from this person or this event. It's a word used for historical records.
And what's wild is that the entire book of Genesis is organized around 10 of these tolados sections. The story of the fall is in the very first one. But look what comes next. The histories of Adam, Noah, his sons, Shem, all the way down to Jacob. It's presented like a continuous, unbroken chain of historical accounts, and that's a huge detail for our investigation.
Let's just zoom in on that second section for a second, the Toledoth of Adam in Genesis chapter 5. I mean, this reads like an official chronicle from an archive. The text follows this super strict, repeating formula. For example, and Adam lived 130 years and begot a son, Seth. Then it goes on, and the days of Adam after he begotten Seth were 800 years, and all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. This exact pattern, he lived, he had a son, he lived some more, and then he died, gets repeated over and over for Seth, for Enos, for Canaan, all the way down the line to Noah. It's the language of a ledger, a historical record, not some symbolic flowing poem.
So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If the author carefully built this book as a series of 10 historical records, family trees, histories of nations, would they just drop a purely symbolic story right at the very beginning? Some scholars argue that would be a glaring incongruity. It just wouldn't fit. It would break the historical pattern that the rest of the book works so hard to establish.
Okay, for our second clue, we're going from that big picture structure down to the microscopic details. We're talking grammar and word choice in one single, incredibly important verse.
Right in the middle of the judgment after the fall, God says there's going to be this ongoing conflict, this enmity between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed. This one phrase has been at the center of intense debate for literally thousands of years. What in the world is this seed?
Well, the Hebrew word for seed, zer, can be a little tricky. It can be singular, meaning one specific descendant, or it can be collective, referring to a whole bunch of offspring, like a people or a nation. So is the verse just talking about a general, ongoing struggle between good and evil, or is it pointing to one specific individual champion who's going to show up someday?
And this is where the grammar gets really fascinating, because while the word seed itself can be a bit ambiguous, the verse then uses singular pronouns. It says, "He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Now, the argument is, if the author meant a whole group of people, they probably would have used plural pronouns. So that grammatical choice, it gives a pretty strong reason to lean towards an individual, messianic interpretation.
All right, for our third and final clue, we're going to fast forward. Let's see how later biblical writers, hundreds and hundreds of years down the line, understood these events in Genesis. Did they read it as history or as a parable?
When you get to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul's writings are a huge piece of this puzzle. For Paul, Adam isn't just a symbol for the universal human predicament. No, he was a real historical guy whose one act of disobedience had real historical consequences for everybody. And Paul then builds his whole argument by contrasting that one act with the one act of obedience by Christ, which brought salvation.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The entire logical structure of Paul's theology of sin and redemption is built on this parallel between two historical individuals, Adam and Christ. If Adam is just a metaphor, then the argument that one man's action could save all of humanity, well, the parallel breaks down, and, as this scholar points out, the whole thing kind of loses its force.
So, after looking at the structure, the grammar, and the way later writers read it, what's the verdict? Well, look, the goal here isn't to solve a millennial-old debate in a few minutes. It's to understand why the stakes are so incredibly high. Because how you answer that question, history or parable, it creates this massive ripple effect. It completely changes how you understand where sin and death come from. It reframes how you see prophecy. It has a direct impact on modern debates about gender roles, the whole idea of original sin, and even the nature of the Bible itself. The bottom line is, this isn't just some academic debate. It defines the entire storyline that follows.
So, in the end, we're left with this question. Is Genesis a book of history, a factual record of the past? Is it a mirror to the soul, a profound reflection of our own lives? Or is it, somehow, both at the same time? There's no easy answer here, but understanding the clues and knowing the consequences shows that how we choose to read this ancient story, well, it truly changes everything.